Welcome. Enjoy the video, subscribe and turn on notifications. I still remember the sparkle in Richard's eyes when we first met at that downtown cafe. He walked in wearing a slightly wrinkled suit, his tie loose around his neck after a long day at work. The way he smiled at me over his coffee cup made my heart flutter. Our courtship was like something out of a movie. Weekend trips to the coast, surprise picnics in the park, and long conversations that stretched into the early hours of the morning. Richard would show up at my apartment with takeout when I mentioned having a rough day at work, and we'd curl up on my worn-out couch watching old movies. The proposal came 6 months later, on a crisp autumn evening. He'd planned an elaborate dinner at the restaurant where we had our first date. I'd barely heard his speech. I was too focused on how his hands trembled slightly as he held the ring. Those first 2 years of marriage were pure bliss. We bought our dream house in the suburbs, painted every room together, and spent Sundays planning our future. Richard would cook breakfast while I worked on my art projects at the kitchen table. He'd peek over my shoulder, genuinely interested in my sketches and ideas. But things started shifting when he got promoted. The late-night strategy meetings became more frequent. Our Sunday brunches turned into solo meals as he caught up on work emails. The house grew quieter. Instead of sharing stories over dinner, I watched him tap away at his laptop, his food getting cold beside him. I noticed the change in small ways at first. The good morning kisses became quick pecks. Date nights were rescheduled, then forgotten. His side of the bed stayed neat and cold, more often than not. When he was home, his mind seemed elsewhere, always checking his phone or muttering about deadlines. Our conversations shortened to brief exchanges about groceries and bills. The man who once spent hours discussing our dreams now barely had time to ask about my day. The silence in our house grew heavier with each passing month, filling the spaces where our laughter used to be. The farmhouse creaked under autumn winds, each sound echoing through empty rooms that used to bubble with laughter and conversation. I traced my fingers along the wooden dining table, perfectly set for two but only used by one. Richard's plate sat untouched again, collecting dust like so many of our shared spaces. My footsteps carried me to our bedroom where his side of the closet hung pristine, suits and dress shirts arranged by color, barely touched since he started spending more nights at the office. The familiar cologne on his clothes had faded, replaced by the sterile scent of dry cleaning. When Richard did come home, his presence felt like a ghost passing through. He'd shuffle through papers at his desk, phone perpetually pressed to his ear, offering distracted nods to my attempts at connection. Just one more call, he'd say, but one turned into many, and eventually I stopped counting. Last week, I'd prepared his favorite meal, herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables. The food grew cold as I waited, checking my phone every few minutes. When he finally arrived past midnight, his tired eyes barely registered the effort. He pecked my cheek with lips that felt foreign, muttered something about a big client, and retreated to his home office. The garden I'd planted in our first year together now sprawled wild and untamed, much like the distance between us. I spent hours there, talking to the flowers instead of my husband. They at least stayed still long enough to listen. Sometimes I caught myself remembering how Richard used to bring me fresh coffee while I weeded, how we'd plan our future between pulling dandelions. Now those memories felt like scenes from someone else's life. Our wedding photos lined the hallway, capturing moments when his smile reached his eyes and his hands found mine without hesitation. 5 years later, those same hands typed endless emails or scrolled through business reports, leaving mine empty and searching for warmth that used to come so naturally. It was our 5th anniversary when Richard surprised me with midnight. I remember standing in our driveway, mouth agape, as the horse trailer pulled up. Richard had a rare, genuine smile on his face, the kind that reached his eyes and reminded me of our early dating days. The trailer door swung open and there he stood, Mayothi, 17 hands of pure magnificence. His coat gleamed like polished obsidian in the morning sun. Our eyes met and something electric passed between us. I approached slowly, my hand outstretched. Midnight lowered his head, his warm breath ghosting across my palm. "It's yours," Richard said, loosening his tie. "I know you've always wanted a horse." The first few weeks were a blur of learning. I spent hours at the stable mastering the basics of horse care, Midnight was patient with me, his gentle nature making every lesson easier. Even when I fumbled with the saddle or took too long brushing his coat, he'd stand perfectly still, occasionally turning his head to nuzzle my shoulder. But as months passed, Richard's visits to the stable grew less frequent. The corporate world pulled him back in, leaving me alone with Midnight more often than not. I didn't mind, though. There was something deeply comforting about the routine we developed. Every morning I'd arrive at the stable, and Midnight would greet me with a soft nickering sound. I'd run my fingers through his silky mane, telling him about my day, my thoughts, my fears. He'd listen, those dark eyes fixed on me with an understanding that sometimes felt almost human. The stable became my sanctuary. While our house grew quieter and colder with Richard's increasing absences, the barn offered warmth and companionship. Midnight's stall became the place where I could breathe freely, away from the suffocating silence of empty rooms and unanswered texts. Sometimes I'd catch Midnight watching me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't fear, it was something else, like he knew things about me that I hadn't yet discovered about myself. When I'd stroke his neck or lean against his strong shoulder, there was an energy there, a connection that went beyond the usual bond between human and animal. One particularly lonely evening, after another cancelled dinner with Richard, I found myself at the stable well past sunset. Midnight seemed to sense my distress. He pressed his velvet nose against my cheek, and in that moment I realized that this magnificent creature had become more than just a gift. He was my confidant, my anchor in a marriage that felt increasingly adrift. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very symbol of Richard's love had become my escape from the growing distance between us. What started as an anniversary present had evolved into something profound and slightly unsettling, a relationship that filled the void my husband's absence had created. I spent more time in Midnight's company than anyone else's. Our rides through the countryside became longer, more frequent. There was something almost magical about those moments. Just us, the rhythm of hoofbeats, and the wind in my hair. In those moments, the emptiness of my home life seemed to fade away, replaced by a connection that grew stronger with each passing day. The barn had become my sanctuary, the one place where the noise in my head quieted to a hum. I'd end up there without even realizing it sometimes, drawn like something magnetic was pulling me. The air smelled of straw and earth, and I'd find myself breathing slower as I stepped inside, as if the barn itself was exhaling relief into me. Midnight always turned his head toward me before I could even say a word, his ears flicking forward when my footsteps echoed against the floorboards. He knew me, more than I wanted to admit. I spent too much time brushing him, I knew that. It wasn't even about grooming anymore, it was about the rhythm, the pull of the brush through his silky coat, the pressure of my hand smoothing over solid muscle. My touch would grow slower, lingering over the curve of his flank or along his neck. I wasn't just brushing, I was feeling. Midnight stood there, still and trusting, his warmth seeping into me the way sunlight sinks into a bare skin. There was a moment the other day when I paused mid-stroke, noticing how his coat shimmered under the dim light filtering through the wooden slats of the barn. My hand hovered, almost trembling with the realization of how intimate it all felt. Midnight shifted slightly, turning his head toward me. His dark eyes were liquid, deep. Too deep. He exhaled through his nose, the soft sound stirring the loose strands of hair escaping from my ponytail. I swallowed hard, feeling heat rise unbidden to my cheeks, heat I tried not to examine too closely. It's just a horse," I'd said aloud once, only to flinch at how hollow those words sounded. Midnight didn't answer me, of course, but the look he gave, it felt like he knew what I didn't want to say out loud. His muzzle bumped gently against my shoulder, slow and deliberate. It wasn't the first time he'd done it, but this time I let it sit longer. My fingers moved absently to trace along the side of his face, the velvet softness of his nose almost tickling my skin. This wasn't normal, I told myself. I knew it wasn't, but somehow that knowledge made it worse. Or better. Maybe both. After hanging up the phone with Richard, my hands trembled. Another late night at the office, another dinner alone. The walls of our house closed in around me, each empty room a reminder of my isolation. I grabbed my coat and headed out to the stables. The summer air hung thick and heavy, wrapping around me like a warm blanket as crickets chirped their evening song. My feet carried me forward almost of their own accord. Midnight's familiar nicker greeted me as I approached his stall. His dark eyes found mine in the dim light, filled with that same warmth and understanding that had been my solace these past months. I slipped inside, breathing in his familiar scent. My fingers traced over his coat as I brushed him, following the defined muscles beneath. The repetitive motion usually calmed me, but tonight felt different. Electric. Each stroke lingered longer than necessary. My hands wandered to places they normally wouldn't, exploring the powerful form before me. I pressed closer, burying my face in his neck. The heat of his body radiated through my thin summer dress. Words of affection spilled from my lips, things I'd never dare voice before. My heart raced as I let my hands roam further, emboldened by the darkness and my desperate need for connection. Midnight stood perfectly still, patient and accepting as always, but even in my haze of loneliness, shame crept in. What was I doing? What kind of person was I becoming? I stumbled back, my face burning. Without finishing the grooming, I fled the stable, the cool night air doing nothing to calm my racing thoughts or ease my guilt. Back in the house, I couldn't shake the memory of those moments or the terrifying reality that part of me wanted to go back. It took me a few days to get used to those thoughts. At first I thought of myself as some kind of freak, but then I came to the realization that the world's rules were never really meant for me. Society forces everyone to conform, to pretend their desires fit into neat, acceptable boxes. But what if my box was just different? What if my so-called wrongness was actually my truth? I remember the first time I let myself feel it fully, without shame, without guilt, without questioning. It was like a weight had been lifted, and for the first time I could breathe. It wasn't about hurting anyone, it was about connection, understanding, a purity that people would never understand because they refuse to look past their blinders. They're the ones who are twisted after all. They slaughter, they cage, they destroy, and yet they call me the monster. I started to see it differently. This wasn't some flaw or defect, it was a gift. I was able to bond with animals in different, deeper ways. In the stillness of the rustic stable, shrouded by the chill of night, I found myself drawn to Midnight, my equine confidant, my secret dream. Each twilight hour, I'd sneak away, forging a haven amidst the hay and wooden stalls, secluded from the world I'd grown weary of. My visits escalated into something more intimate, yet detached from the raw affection that I'd shared with him up until then. A longing, a hunger, an obsession that I couldn't quite explain, boiled beneath the surface, threatening to erupt. I deliberated over the unspoken yearning, holding back, yet unable to quell the relentless pull. Each touch, each whispered word, each soft caress ignited an inferno within me, stoking my growing infatuation. The lines between horse and companion blurred, and what once fueled my heart with a strange comfort now consumed it. Midnight became more than a creature of flesh and blood. He was my fantasy, my escape, an illicit obsession that I was powerless to resist. Even at night, I dreamt of our encounters. It was like Beauty and the Beast. I was in my own world that evening, seeking solace in the stable like I always did. The setting sun cast long shadows through the wooden slats, creating an intimate atmosphere that wrapped around me like a warm blanket. My hands traced Midnight's muscular frame, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing beneath my fingertips. The day had been particularly difficult. Another missed dinner, another cold bed, another reminder of Richard's absence. But here, with Midnight, I found the connection I desperately craved. His coat gleamed in the dim light, and his presence filled the emptiness inside me. I pressed myself closer, letting my body melt against his warm flank. Lost in the moment, I didn't hear the approaching footsteps. It wasn't until I caught movement in my peripheral vision that I realized I wasn't alone. There stood Richard, frozen mid-stride at the stable entrance, his briefcase hanging limply from his hand. The look on his face, shock, confusion, something else I couldn't quite name, made my stomach drop. Time seemed to stop as our eyes met across the dimly lit stable. The intimacy of the moment shattered like glass, leaving me exposed and vulnerable under his stunned gaze. My hands stilled on Midnight's coat, but I couldn't bring myself to step away. I stood in the stable, my hands trembling, the familiar scent of hay and leather mixed with the oppressive stillness of the air. Richard's eyes crashed into me like a storm, cold and unforgiving, demanding answers I wasn't ready to give. But I knew I couldn't evade it any longer. Midnight stirred in his stool, shifting as if sensing the tension radiating through the dimly lit space. The weight of the moment pressed down on my chest until breathing felt impossible. For a second I thought of running, just slipping out the side door and disappearing into the night. But where would I go? What would that solve? Instead, I sank onto the wooden bench along the stable wall, unable to meet Richard's piercing gaze. The anger in his voice was sharper than I'd ever heard, breaking through the walls I had so carefully built around myself. "What's going on, Jessica?" His words cut through the thick silence, razor sharp. "I see it in the way you've been acting, the secrecy, the distance. Tell me what's wrong." I tried to speak, but the words lodged in my throat. Tears had already begun falling, hot and relentless, streaking down my face. Midnight nickered softly, his head poking out over the stall door, watching me with those soulful eyes that understood too much. I focused on the lines of his glossy coat, feeling the tiniest sliver of comfort, even as I unraveled. "You're not saying anything," Richard snapped, taking a step closer, his shoes scraping against the stable floor. Midnight's ears flicked, his body tensing. I shook my head, desperate to stop the flood I felt coming, but it was useless. Every carefully hidden secret, every moment I'd tried to push down, clawed its way to the surface. My voice broke when I finally spoke. I didn't know what else to do. "What does that even mean?" He crossed his arms, scrutinizing me. His form loomed over me, his usual air of composed authority now tinged with raw frustration. And so, piece by piece, I let it out. The loneliness, the emptiness. All the ways I'd tried to reach him, to get through the endless noise of his work and his ambition, only to be pushed aside like some afterthought. The words spilled out too fast, each one landing heavy in the confined space. His expression hardened with every syllable, his brows narrowing into an unrelenting line. Then I confessed what I'd never thought I'd say out loud. My connection to Midnight, how it had started as solace and companionship, had turned into something darker, something I couldn't even explain to myself. Each time I tried to find the right words, they stuck like thorns in my throat, tearing at me as they came out. I was lost, I stammered, choking on my own justification. "I didn't have anyone else, Richard. Midnight, he was always there." The silence that followed was deafening. No sounds except the faint rustle of straw or the muted shifting of Midnight's hooves. Richard's face froze in disbelief before the fury took hold. "Stop," he spat, his voice trembling with anger. "You're talking about a goddamn horse, Jessica." The word came out sharp, like he couldn't even fathom stringing it into the rest of the venom building in him. His hands clenched at his sides and he took a step back, as if repelled by my presence. "Are you hearing yourself right now?" I flinched but couldn't look away. Midnight jerked his head, his ears pinned, as though Richard's rising voice spooked him. My heart pounded as I watched the vein throbbing at the side of Richard's temple, his jaw tight enough to splinter. "Do you even understand what you're saying?" His words were laced with disgust. "You're telling me you... What the hell is wrong with you?" Tears blurred my vision, but they didn't stop. I fell to my knees, my palms pressed against the gritty wood beneath me. I begged him to understand, but deep down, I knew no words would reach him. "You don't get it," I sobbed. "I had nothing. You were never there, and Midnight... He filled that void. He gave me what you wouldn't." "That's not love, Jessica!" His voice cracked, filled with something raw and untamed. "You're trying to justify something that's..." He stopped himself, unable to even finish the sentence. He paced in circles, rubbing his temples, his breath coming faster with each passing second. "You were lonely, so you..." He trailed off again, shaking his head as though trying to wake himself up from a nightmare. Richard's rejection lashed out like a whip, yet I didn't stop trying. My words came out desperate, shattered. "He listened to me when you wouldn't. I'd sit here for hours, and he understood me." I wiped my face with trembling hands, staring into the dull patterns of the wooden floor. It's not wrong to want to feel connection, to want to feel something. "You're insane," he hissed, his face pale now, his hands shaking as he gestured at me. "I can't believe I'm standing here, listening to this." Each word brought another fracture I couldn't mend. Midnight poured at the ground, a low, mournful sound escaping him. Even that hurt more than I could explain. My broken sobs echoed alongside the suffocating silence that followed Richard's latest outburst. There was nothing left to say. I watched Richard's back as he walked away, his rigid posture cutting through the evening air like a knife. The stable's familiar warmth turned cold around me as I collapsed into the straw, my body racked with sobs. The sweet hay scent that usually brought me comfort now felt suffocating. Midnight's soft nicker reached my ears, but even his presence couldn't ease the crushing weight in my chest. The following days blurred together in a haze of unanswered calls and hollow silences. I kept waiting for Richard to come around, to understand, to show some glimpse of the man who'd once gifted me this beautiful horse. The knock on our door came early one morning. 2 officers stood on our porch, their faces stern as they handed me official-looking papers. My hands shook as I read through the legal jargon, the words criminal charges and court summons jumping out at me. Richard had actually reported me. The realization hit harder than any physical blow could have. My phone started buzzing constantly, not with support but with judgment. Sarah from the local riding club texted to let me know I was no longer welcome. The grocery store clerk who used to chat with me about horses now averted her eyes. Even Mrs. Peterson, who'd brought us a welcome casserole when we first moved in, crossed the street to avoid me. Social media exploded with whispered accusations and outright condemnation. People I'd considered friends shared links to news articles about the incident, adding their own horrified comments. My name became synonymous with scandal in our small community. The quiet life I'd built here crumbled around me, leaving nothing but debris and disgrace. I watched from my kitchen window as people drove by our property, slowing down to stare at the farm that had become the center of local gossip. Some even took pictures. The sanctuary I'd created here transformed into a fishbowl of judgment and shame. Each passing car felt like another nail in the coffin of my former life. The worst part wasn't the legal troubles or the community's reaction, it was the betrayal. Richard knew me better than anyone. He knew my heart, my struggles, my deep connection with Midnight. Yet he chose to destroy everything, to expose me to public shame rather than try to understand. His cold efficiency in dismantling our life together felt like a calculated cruelty I never thought him capable of. The next few weeks passed in a blur of courtroom appearances and legal proceedings. My life had become a public spectacle with local news outlets covering every detail of my case. The courtroom's wooden benches felt harder and colder with each passing day as I sat there, watching my life unravel before strangers' eyes. The prosecutor's voice echoed through the chamber, methodically laying out every detail of my relationship with Midnight. Each word felt like a knife, cutting deeper into whatever dignity I had left. Photos were displayed, evidence was presented, and witnesses took the stand. My lawyer tried his best to paint me as someone who had been emotionally abandoned, desperate for connection, but even I could see the jury's faces growing more disgusted with each passing testimony. Richard sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, his face set in stone. He never looked at me directly, but I could feel the weight of his presence. He'd moved out weeks ago, taking only essential belongings and leaving behind a house full of memories that now felt tainted. My attempts to reach him, calls, messages, even a letter, all went unanswered. The silence hurt more than any words could have. When it came time for sentencing, the judge's words were clear and cutting. The gavel's sound sealed my fate, and I watched as my world officially crumbled around me. The reputation I'd built, the life I'd known, all of it was gone in that moment. The hardest part was seeing Midnight one last time as they led me away. Richard had gotten full custody of him, and I caught a glimpse of them through the courthouse window. The black stallion stood proudly next to my soon-to-be ex-husband, his coat gleaming in the sunlight. Even from a distance, I could see how well Richard was caring for him. It was a final twist of the knife, knowing that the 2 beings I'd loved most would go on without me, probably better off for it.
Hey everyone, if you enjoyed the story, remember to like, subscribe and comment on the video for more stories like this. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. If you have any similar stories to share, leave them in the comments and we'll make sure to bring them to life. Thanks for watching.